Welcome to The Impact Effect, hosted by conscious leadership expert Tom Eddington, advisor to some of the world's most successful companies and CEOs, where each week we help executives, entrepreneurs, and organizers become more effective leaders while growing businesses that are making an impact in the world. And now, here's Tom.
Hi, welcome to the Impact Effect Network, where we discuss making business matter through conscious leadership. I'm delighted to have my guest today, Gina Hayden, join me to be in a conversation around conscious leadership. Gina's based in London, and we were just chatting before the show about how delighted she is to be in London and not on airplanes. Welcome, Gina. Great to have you today.
Thanks very much, Tom. Really good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, my pleasure. I had reached out to you hoping I could have you as a guest for season 1, and between my schedule and yours, it didn't work out. So I'm really happy to have you for season 2. And I'd love to start by just having you share to the audience a bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I think there's something around pre-COVID life and post-COVID life, I would say. Background in pre-COVID, doing a lot of work with companies, a lot of work with leadership teams, a lot of work with CEOs, and really working in the space of conscious leadership, running leadership programs, and really helping businesses and the people in charge of them to think about how do they be whole people at work? How do they help their teams to bring the whole of themselves to work? And really getting a kick. I think I really get a kick from helping people to stretch into the areas of themselves that they maybe haven't explored yet, that they may have had limitations before, and really doing that for a range of different companies around the world. And I think post-COVID, probably with all of us, now it feels very different. Now it feels like all those ideas about myself and who I used to be, they feel a lot more tenuous. They feel a lot more like something of on the other side of the watershed. So I think now I'm spending a lot more time at home, and I'm working virtually with leaders in a very similar capacity, but in a much more well-paced way, a lot less, you were mentioning planes, a lot less running around, a lot less sitting in a tube in the sky, a lot more being here, with some space in between to be present and be with the people that I work with, even though it's now in a virtual capacity.
And how did you find yourself in the conscious leadership space, and particularly working with leaders and leadership teams?
My background is as a psychologist, and I was working in London for one of the big consulting firms. And I was doing leadership development there, and I always felt there was something more. At the time, I was quite involved in what I felt to be authentic leadership. You know, how do we show up from behind the front and the persona that we put out in front of people? I didn't really have the language for that yet, and through a series of personal circumstances in life, I ended up back in South Africa where my daughter was born, and one of those synchronistic events or series of events happened where I happened to be clicking through some internet links and ended up discovering a pro-consciousness coaching, which, of course, life being the way life is, meant that there was one Monday, and it happened to be in Johannesburg, and I was living on the south coast in South Africa. I went there, and that sort of, you know, when you read those things and you go, oh, that's exactly it. That's exactly the thing that I need. So I got involved in that, and then I began thinking about, I wonder how my sort of leadership work, my work in companies, matches with this new world of consciousness. And then I discovered conscious capitalism and this notion of conscious leadership. This was about 2009, where there wasn't as much of it around then as there is now. I remember, I think conscious capitalism was still a sort of a white paper online. But what was interesting was I had a feeling, and I hope we speak about this. I had a feeling, you get that knowing inside yourself. I had a feeling that I needed to be in a room in London, back in London, with interestingly with Raj Sodhi and John Mackey. There was just a feeling that I had, and I began blogging, and then through a series of events, I ended up in Boston at the Conscious Capitalism conference, and then back in London, I ended up at a lunch with Raj and a sort of putting a CEO dinner on for John Mackey. And there was just a sense, I remember sitting back at one point and just going, this is exactly what I thought needed to happen. And I hadn't really done very much. And life sort of arranged the circumstances for it to happen. And really from that, I got very interested through this journey around, there's quite a bit of stuff around what do organizations look like who practice conscious business, but I'm really interested in the leaders themselves. What brought them to that point? How do they think? How do they operate? How do they function in that way in a mainstream business where it's often much more difficult to be that kind of person? And I thought, when I wrote this book a few years ago, when I was interviewing a lot of them, was how can we map some of those qualities that if other people read them or read about these examples, they begin to recognize these qualities in themselves, bring some of those qualities forward in them as people, as human beings, as leaders. And that makes me feel inspired and passionate for sure.
And so what has that journey been like for you since 2009 and diving deeper into this work and working with some of the leaders you've worked with?
I think there's been a change over the last few years, I would say. And again, I'm going to kind of weave in the life side of things as well. So there's a personal piece as well for me of feeling like some of the work that I used to make myself do. I had this driver, this kind of survival driver, this security driver, which really is based in fear, right? Of having to say yes to stuff. So I would sometimes find myself, this is about 3-4 years ago, in some programs. I remember one program I was in out of New York somewhere at this event with a really not very nice client. And being the spiritual teacher that I work with, who happens to be based in India, and just can you talk me down from a cliff here because I'm hating this? And he was just saying, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And why was I doing it? I was doing it because I felt I didn't have a choice and I had to do it, and I couldn't get off the treadmill. So there were pockets of working with kind of conscious leadership and with people who were interested in the being, not just the doing. What I found over time is, I think within myself, there's a feeling that I just can no longer physically bring myself to say yes to things that don't feel right for me. And I feel I can no longer really make, I hope I don't eat my words one day, but I feel I can no longer make myself do that. But I don't know what the future holds either. And there's a kind of a trust in that. There's a kind of I just have to trust life. And what's happened with that kind of personal journey woven in is that these clients have come into my kind of universe, my ecosystem, and they've been really interested off the back of the book, actually, really interested in some of the work there. So now I'm working with a range of leaders, some of them very senior, some of them very, very interested in how do you blend being and doing in business. And so what that's meant latterly, let's say for the past year and a half or so, is working with organizations around these big questions of purpose and values and authenticity and impact and individual purpose linked to organizational purpose. So when I stand back and look at it and think, I think the thing that I felt that I wanted to be doing more of, or that I wanted to serve more has kind of come into being and come to the foreground without too much meddling by me.
Well, before we get too much further into the conversation, I'd love for you to just define what do you mean when you say conscious leadership? You've referenced being and doing a couple of times. You've referenced a few other things, but I'd love for you to just define conscious leadership.
Yeah, so I think that the frame I find really helpful is this frame of me to we to the world. And I think being more conscious as a leader probably means being more aware, more conscious in the me space. So things like knowing my triggers and managing myself more consciously when I'm getting triggered, knowing what I care about, so knowing my values, knowing what creates me, knowing that that I have choice over how I want to keep molding myself, having a sense of maybe what I want to create, and having a sense of living choice rather than reaction. So for me, those sorts of things are in the me space. I think in the we space then is, how does that transfer across to relationships? So if you're in a business, how am I working with my teams? How am I working with other stakeholders? How am I even working with competitors? And I think that goes right the way into the world space. And for me, it's what am I standing for in the world? Not just thinking about my impact as a leader, as a business, in terms of the years hence, and also I think not just knowing myself better and managing that more and thinking about relationships, but then I do think there's something about conscious leadership which is contributing in some way. I think we get here to the value of business, which I know we share, and what it can contribute. So if we're more conscious as leaders, if we're more aware, if we're thinking more about how we manage ourselves, how we are in our relationships, and perhaps how we live our own sense of purpose out through our business, then we can start getting into this really rich field, which is what is the impact that our business can actually have on the world around us. And I think there we start tapping into the potential of business as a force for good. And I think that's still really untapped. It was beginning to come more to the fore, I think, over the last couple of years. And I think COVID has just come in and seems to have stopped that because we're in survival mode a lot. So I'm curious to see where it all goes.
Well, I'd love to hear you share a bit about how it is that leaders find you and what they are interested in working with you to help them with, what the journey's like, and how is it different from what they thought they were going to experience.
That's a great question. Well, how they find me tends to be through, I mean, there's the usual kind of word of mouth and things like that, but it also tends to happen through these kind of synchronicitous events, really. So, for instance, I remember I interviewed, it actually goes back to, I interviewed a woman called Lorna Davis, who was on the executive board of Danone at the time. And then she started running the US enterprise for them. And it was a great interview. And a few months later, she contacted me to say, did I want to help to run a leadership program for the B Corp community in Switzerland? So Lorna and I joined a couple of B Corp people and about 20 of their leaders from around Europe. And we had this amazing 2-3 day event in the mountains in Switzerland. And then I was coming back on the train from Montreux, and I thought I'd just write a post about it. So I put that on LinkedIn. And it happened to be seen by Pam Furman and Cam Danielson from the Conscious Leadership Institute in the US. And then Pam and I had a couple of conversations, and then they introduced me to one of their big clients. So the big piece of work we're doing right now is actually working with one of their big clients. The CEO is very much on a journey of kind of edge of consciousness journey, and they've changed from insurance company from a typical reinsurer to a reinsurer that's really all around how life is precious and how do we actually increase the value and the preciousness of life for all of our clients and for all the people affected by insurance. So it's this really big change that's happened from something. And I would say, how did that happen? Well, I happened to do an interview and wrote this book, which the leader read. But I happened to write a blog, which happened to be read. And there's that kind of stuff that feels out of my control, really. It's kind of surprise and I guess a bit mystical. It's not very logical.
And so when you start working with the leaders, they presumably come to you with a set of intentions, a set of goals or aspirations, and then you take them on a journey. And what do you witness in your interactions with them?
I think it's really important to understand that different people seem to be ready for different things. What we can't do, I think, is sort of shove conscious leadership down people's throats, because certain people care about different things. Yeah, and I think that's fine. So the biggest conversations I tend to have with people in companies will be, and in fact, there was one of these just last week, a group of women who were experiencing exactly the same themes. It's either, I'm not heading up the company, so I don't like the culture, so I'm discovering more of myself, and so I'm going to leave and start something on my own because the place that I'm at can't what I need. That's one conversation. How do I get what I need? And leaders will often say, those who are really woken up and feeling woken up to what's important to them, what they truly care about, what they want to serve, they will often feel, it's been described to me as a kind of a sense of pain of being in a place where they don't have the positional power, but they're feeling so cut off from themselves that they actually can't be there. I remember one leader telling me that he had flown with his son across, I forget which part it was, but just seeing the kind of plastics strewn over, and he just felt this need to do something, but he couldn't get the charge in the company to actually take it as seriously as he did. So there was a real emotional pain. So there's something about, do I leave and start myself? The other conversation I tend to have is, how do you influence the stakeholders to care in the right way, to care about what you care about? And often that conversation goes with finding frequently junior people in the company who seem to care about things and forming kind of cells or pods of influence rather than doing it in a hierarchical way. So those are often the conversations we have. I think the answer to your question is what's the entry point? If there is something, I think maybe the greatest leadership challenge of our time is getting more people, more leaders in organizations to think about scaling up their impact. And so how do you do that? How do you make that accessible for people who maybe think that the word conscious is very woo-woo? How do you get them to begin to think about that? And I think a really good way in is through self, through the lens of the me, the me to reach the world, the me, and often exploring values and a sense of purpose. Values is often the point. So the kind of work, how it generally turns out is doing work around values, and then looking at how does that come to life, and how are you coming to life in the organization. I do quite a bit of, call it skills work. So I'll end up in a place where we're doing influence skills, or Yes, something that's kind of quite skilly, and that's fine. And yet, the work at the level of being with what they care about, what they want for themselves, how they connect with others, I think that is definitely more fulfilling and motivating. And going in that route tends to be, I think, values is a really good door entry. It's also very accessible to people. They can have a conversation about values. And that leads to all kinds of other things, coaching, working with teams, having quite deep conversations about who they are, they care about.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Who you are is how you lead. Conscious leadership is an intuitive, intentional process requiring an open heart, an open mind, and a committed desire to fully own how you show up in the world. If you're a CEO, a solopreneur, or a community leader, Tom Eddington's ebook helps you amplify your strengths, making you the best version of yourself. Download the ebook today and become a part of bringing conscious leadership to the planet.
And what are your, when you think about your career and the work you're doing, obviously it's very fulfilling, but what are your aspirations for what you hope to achieve personally as a practitioner in conscious leadership?
I'm smiling a lot at that question because that's back to pre-COVID and post-COVID. I'm going to be really honest with you here. Pre-COVID, I would have said, I really want to do some more of this work. I want to help people to become more of who they can be. I'd like to have some kind of impact. I think these things are important. So I would get on a plane to go and do some work that I felt was important and meaningful and impactful. And there'd always be a combination of kind of guilt and desire to make an impact. And when I think about it now, I was always living in this unresolved state of going off somewhere to hang out with a group of strangers for a week in the hope, kind of wanting to contribute, but actually really wanting to be home with my daughter who was growing up. And, so that balance was always a difficult one to strike. Now, having been at home since February, I'm asking myself a different set of questions. So every evening I've made supper for us. We sit down, we have supper together. It's been the most wonderful experience. And I think there's really there's nothing more important than this. And to do the work, but I get to do it virtually now. And now it feels a lot less about, when you talk about impact or ask about impact, it feels a lot less about like, what massive thing do I want to do out there that has a big impact? And it feels more about what's the life that I'm living right now. And to live my best life. When we were chatting before, and I was saying it feels like I'm living my best life. And in doing that, I'm probably being gracious with the work that I'm doing with the leaders that I work with, the businesses that I'm involved in, because I'm more present, because I've got to think, because I arrive at whatever conversation we're having, not rushing from the previous one or having gotten off a plane on a different time zone, but actually I arrive having had space to contemplate and be present and be there for them. So I hear them, so I can ask better quality questions. It's really got me. I've spoken to a number of people who have said that this time has made them rethink everything that they took for granted and rediscover what they really value. I think the same is true for me as well. Aspirationally, I'd love to see, when we look at the absolute absence of conscious leadership in the political arena at the moment, it's just jaw-dropping. And businesses kind of going through its own. So I hope to contribute to senior people whose ways of thinking about themselves impact the thousands of people in their organization and the experiences of all those people. And I'd like to do that without paying the price that I've paid to this point.
And so when the world opens up again, how will you balance wanting to be there with your daughter and having the experiences and the time you've had in the last 6 months with what likely will be business opportunities and calling to go do more work?
So ethically, I'm truly hoping that we won't be we won't have companies saying, and some of my clients are saying this probably won't happen. Are we really going to say, here's £100,000 for 25 leaders to fly to Singapore with 6 facilitators to go and do a week? Like, are we really going to buy into that anymore? Or are we going to do what we've had to start doing over the last 6 months, which is finding a way to do this virtually? I'm not saying that. I think there's a lot of value in face-to-face and the virtual when we look at it together and create a container. It is harder to do it online for sure. It's like a 2-dimensional rather than a 3-dimensional experience. But perhaps we'll be more discerning about when we get people together and what we can do online and think of it. I think this COVID situation has forced us to think more deep about how we can do things differently rather than let's just get on planes and go. So business opportunities, my partner used a term yesterday, which I really liked. He was talking about a mixed economy and how we've been forced to create a mixed economy for ourselves. So I do a bit of, so I'm doing the online work. Ironically, I'm doing some trading on the markets, which is sort of a kind of a plan B back burner thing. I might write some more. I might look at some online, actually maybe turning the work that I'm doing and the work of the book into an offering for coaches and for leaders. That might be an interesting project. What I'm finding though is I think there's a difference between what do we want and what do we need. Certainly this whole year has shown me that I need a lot less than what I thought I did. It seems easier to live more quietly. So that thing around in the past, I would have gone, oh, here's lots of opportunities. Let's chase them because it's so exciting. And then I'd live with the guilt. Now it feels more like, actually, is that really necessary, or do I choose something differently? And I've spoken to a few people who said, I'm not going back. I really like to think I would be the same.
And with the insights that you've achieved or witnessed in the last 6 months, and some of the conversations and the work you've done with clients over the last 6 months, do you have a sense of what your clients are going to need that's going to be different going forward?
I think there are 2 things that I notice that are coming out. One is that we seem to do work in the past, which was keeping ourselves in a work box and everything else in a separate box. And lately when we've been on, or during the COVID times when we've been on video calls, etc., you sort of see the people's kids coming into the frame. You see their real selves coming out, and I think you see everybody else on the video call is kind of smiling because there's this recognition of this whole person that's turning up, and I think there's probably 2 things with that. The one is I see the work, and I'm seeing the work around how to integrate all aspects of yourself: mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, purpose. Those different facets of ourselves seems to be a theme that's coming through now because we've been forced to recognize that we're whole people who turn up in the workplace. The other thing I think that I'm noticing is the challenges that come with that. So sometimes people are wanting to go to work because they're living in a 1-bedroom flat on their own. They're looking for that connection. I think the other thing around people saying, I want to keep the connection with my family. I don't want to go back to the office. So I think, as I'm thinking it through, this theme around what does connection mean to us? How do we stay connected to ourselves and stay connected to each other in the workplace where we don't go to an office? I've seen these things in the New York Times, where they do, like, someone goes into New York Times and into the offices and they take photographs of the offices, and it's like a memo from the 22nd of February and dead plants. And you think, did we really used to get on a train and all go and sit in this room together to go and perform work? I mean, just preposterous notion. So actually, I think this thing around what does work mean to us? How do we stay connected to our families, to ourselves, to our colleagues? And what does that connection mean? And how much are we willing to put up with? What does that mean for like cities, organizations, offices? It's all up for grabs. And I think that's a really big question that everyone's grappling with right now.
Yeah, it's interesting as technology was introduced, or at least the current technology was introduced about 20 or 25 years ago. Organizations and individuals in those organizations started having the conversation around work-life balance. And that whole phraseology of work-life balance started showing up in the last couple of decades. And for me, I've always shared with my clients, there's no such thing, there's only life. And that, particularly for leaders, it's the life that they chose. And with what's happened in the last 6 months, it's really shining a light on work-life balance. And people are realizing that all those artificial aspects that they tried to create to have a sense, it was a false sense, but this false sense of work was separate from the rest of their life. And it's unavoidable now. You can't help but, as you were describing, people showing up on the Zoom call and their children on their laps and their kids are coloring, and it's an accurate reflection of what was always going on. It was just a false sense of we could separate somehow our work self from the rest of our lives.
Yeah, maybe that's one of the good things to come out of COVID. I know, we were saying before, I feel like I feel extremely grateful every day. Honestly, this is like, wow, I just feel grateful to be here and the kind of quality of life. And I also know that and recognize I'm very fortunate. So, because there's a lot of suffering there. So I think there's some good things. There's a lot of suffering and there are some good things to come out of this as well. The importance of connection being one of them.
Yeah,
what whole self.
Yeah, what I'm witnessing and experiencing, in terms of what's happening in the world and what's happening in society is very much a reflection of my personal journey of, getting profoundly ill back in 2004 and not being able to work for a better part of 6 years. And while the rest of the world was going on, I was incapable of doing most things, and certainly not able to work during that period. And it gave me that gift of being able to spend the time with my children, the time to help them grow up, to do a lot of my own personal work. And I wouldn't wish that experience on anybody, but it was an incredible gift for me. And in an ironic kind of way, what everybody's experiencing now with COVID is in its own way a reflection of what I personally went through about 14 years ago or so.
Yeah, I agree. I think, what I've been trying to articulate as well is the sense of there's like a loosening of, you mentioned it with the way that we try to separate out work from everything else in our lives. Some kind of construct we had in our mind that this is what being at work meant. For me, the sense that the ideas that I had, the identity that we all construct identities. So my sense of identity, what it feels like it's disintegrated to a certain degree, which is why this question around, like what kind of impact on that? I don't know. I don't know. So maybe this is what COVID has done, a bit like in the way that you were describing 14 years. It's really shaken up everything about how we think about ourselves and about each other. I hope that we come out of it better and more awake and more aware. I keep, although less so, hearing people say, I can't wait to get back to normal. And I don't think how do you go back to normal after this? How do you unsee what you've seen?
Yeah. And what is normal anyway?
What is and what is normal anyway.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Is your team tuned out? Are you looking for a powerful speaker to motivate and inspire your organization? Then Tom Eddington is the choice for keynote speaker at your next conference or event. Tom is one of the most sought-after business advisors and coaches in Silicon Valley. For over 2 decades, Tom has advised world-renowned CEOs and executives on how to catapult their organization's success, including Hewlett-Packard, NBNA Corporation, and Royal Dutch Shell. In his dynamic keynotes, Tom offers fresh new paradigms on how to create healthier, happier, and more purposeful workplaces while navigating change and generating higher degrees of success for organizations. For information on booking Tom at your next event, contact eddingtonadvisory.com.
Gina, I'd love for you to just reflect on our conversation today. And what's the one thing or 2 things you'd like for the audience to take away from our conversation?
Maybe the biggest thing is to really tap into what is important to you, to really tap into maybe to what your heart says, what your heart is telling you. I think so much of our conversation has been about living this life separate from what we really want. And I think perhaps what COVID has brought, if it's brought any gift, is waking up to that and asking ourselves what's truly important to us. And technology has enabled us to find workarounds to be with who is important to us and be with what is important to us, and to not live in such an illusion anymore. So perhaps reflecting on our conversation, I think that the takeaway for me as well, the kind of conclusion, insight for me is just this importance of really asking, maybe tapping into our values, tapping into our connections, tapping into what we love and into maybe what our hearts are saying, and maybe being guided by that rather than our ideas about ourselves, and maybe really looking to live our best lives.
Well, thank you for that. And for the viewers and listeners that would like to get in touch with you and learn more about your work, what's the best way for folks to reach out to you?
They could just ping me on LinkedIn. Probably easiest email address is gina.hayden@icloud.com. Pretty easy. Otherwise, reach out on LinkedIn. I'm available there as well.
Well, thank you, Gina. It's been wonderful to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for inviting me.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Thank you for joining Tom Eddington on the Impact Effect. Visit impacteffectnetwork.com to connect with Tom and discover additional episodes featuring today's top leaders making a global impact through conscious leadership in the world today.